I think it's safe for us to get started here. Welcome everyone to SINAI's webinar, Measuring and Managing Scope 3 Emissions, and thank you for joining us. Scope 3 emissions are a hot topic right now. We're looking forward to presenting an introduction and best practices to tackling Scope 3 emissions today. Rest assured, we will share a recording of this event. Sorry, just making sure everyone can hear me. So I'm getting, okay, sorry. Some audio interruptions here, apologies. So we will be sending a recording of the webinar to all attendees today. And we'll just dive right in. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce SINAI. SINAI is the planet's leading decarbonization intelligence platform for enterprise organizations. Our software platform serves customers across more than 60 countries in measuring, analyzing, pricing, and reducing emissions. Alicia and Caillou are SINAI's brilliant climate experts that will be presenting today's webinar with a little help from myself, Ariel, the marketing manager at SINAI. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have questions after the webinar. And the agenda for today. We will be covering the basics of Scope 3 emissions, talk about best practices for calculating Scope 3 and applying methodologies to calculating Scope 3. We'll cover SINAI's approach and discuss mitigation options within Scope 3 emissions. Finally, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, depending on how many questions everybody has. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. And with that, I will hand it over to Alicia.
Great, thanks, Ariel. So I'll get us started by talking about what are Scope 3 emissions and really the importance of them. So for those of you who are new to the GHG space, if there's any of those on the call, I'll go kind of over what kind of Scope 1, 2, and then Scope 3 emissions are. So our Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources from, say, the reporting company, like your company. So an example of this could be like natural gas combustion in a processing plant, if you guys own kind of complex processing facilities, or it could be things like your energy consumption within your offices. Now, our Scope 2 emissions are indirect emissions from the generation or purchasing of acquired electricity or other utilities such as steam or heat or cooling. So you are responsible for these emissions. However, you have less control really how the energy is generated or our electricity or utilities. Now, our Scope 3 emissions are everything else for a reporting company. So they are our indirect emissions from your particular owned or operated facilities, and indirect emissions that really aren't included in Scope 2. These emissions are emissions that occur in the value chain of your company, and they can be basically both upstream and downstream. And as you can see by this graph on the screen, both our upstream and our downstream activities for Scope 3 are divided into 15 different categories. And they're really categorized that way in order to be mutually exclusive and enable companies to kind of have a standard approach to calculating their Scope 3 GHG emissions. So I'll get into kind of a little bit more detail on what exactly Scope 3 emissions mean for, say, a product in a value chain. So if we think about a product that you use, purchase, or sell, obviously there's various emission sources that are responsible for the emissions with generating this product. Now, depending on what part of the value chain you own or operate, these emissions associated with products could be your Scope 1, they could be your Scope 2, or they could be your Scope 3 to your operations. So I'm going to walk through an example of a battery electric vehicle. And in this particular example, we're going to assume that your company or the reporting company is really only responsible for the manufacturing of the batteries and the battery electric vehicle car assembly. So this means that all other emissions associated with this car or this car production are going to be either upstream or downstream Scope 3. So if we think about the components for a battery electric vehicle, the upstream Scope 3 emissions would include emissions associated with the mining and the processing of all of the materials, so things such as metal, steel, copper, nickel, required for the construction of both the battery and the car, as well as the transportation of the materials around the globe. So you might mine the materials in one area and ship it to another area for the processing or for the car assembly. Now, our downstream emissions include basically anything from transportation that's you're not controlling from your particular operations. It could contribute, storage of the vehicles could contribute to some downstream emissions, the retail of the vehicle, and then a big one in this case would be really the use of the battery electric vehicles. So any emissions associated with electricity used in the car, and then finally, really the disposal or recycling of the car and all the parts within it. So hopefully that gives you a bit more of a details kind of around Scope 3 for a particular operation. So why is Scope 3 important? So if we want to make really measurable impacts on reducing the impact of climate change, we do need to start taking responsibility for our Scope 3 emissions. So in most value chains, you can imagine that there's probably one part of the value chain that is heavy emitting. And really, if we want to reduce our emissions, entire value chains need to work together in order to finance the emission reduction opportunities in these heavy emitting portions of, say, your particular value chain. Now, if we always assume these emissions are somebody else's problem, then we're going to have a really tough time having declining emissions globally. So in recent years, there's been many regulations and reporting frameworks that are requiring a little bit more robust Scope 3 disclosures. According to the SBTi, so Science-Based Targets Initiative, what they've said recently is that if a company has significant Scope 3 emissions, it should set a Scope 3 target. Now, the SBTi has defined significant Scope 3 emissions as an organization that has Scope 3 emissions, which are more than 40% of total Scope 1, 2, and 3. So if we look at the graph on the right, and your Scope 3 portion is that gold or yellow colored portion on the right, basically if that bar looks more than 40% of the total line, then Scope 3 emissions would be material. And you can see that for pretty much every sector, it is likely that your Scope 3 emissions are going to be material to your operations. And again, this does really depend on what processes you own and operate. But generally, most companies will have significant Scope 3. Now, because you are required to set a Scope 3 target, Scope 3 targets in this case do not necessarily need to be as detailed as Scope 1 and 2. So the SBTi only requires that companies set a target for a minimum of 67% or 2/3 of their Scope 3 emissions. So this basically means that you could potentially leave out some of your Scope 3 emissions from your targets that you're setting. And then really because these targets, let's say right now at least, aren't as stringent, but they should really be ambitious, they should be measurable, and we do want to clearly demonstrate how your company is addressing the main sources of your Scope 3 emissions or the emissions within your value chain, really in line with current best practices. So in addition to the SBTi, other organizations have also started to require more robust Scope 3 disclosures. So recently, the SEC in the US has proposed a rule that they would require Scope 3 disclosures if they are material or if the filer has a target. And under this reporting framework, emissions would have to be in both absolute and intensity GHG terms. In addition to the SEC, the TCFD and CDP and others are also working to harmonize recommendations around more robust Scope 3 disclosures. So if you want to go to the next slide, Ariel, now that we know that Scope 3 is really important and we have a bit of a background, I'm going to get into a little bit more details on how to actually calculate our Scope 3 emissions. So here on the slide, what we've done is we've outlined 3 key steps for calculating your Scope 3 emissions. As I mentioned earlier, there's many different Scope 3 categories, so I'll get into that a little bit on the next slide. But our calculation methodologies and the data required for each of these calculations and knowing really where to start can be extremely daunting. So prior to data collection, the GHG protocol, which is a great standard for calculating Scope 3 emissions, really recommends that first companies kind of sit down, define their business goals, and really try and identify what the most relevant Scope 3 categories are going to be for your business. So a company's business goals should really be defined because we want to look at those Scope 3 categories that are most relevant so they can really receive the most attention. And those relevant categories are going to be categories that are expected to have, say, the highest GHG emissions. Maybe they offer the most significant GHG reduction opportunities for your business. Or, for example, they might be relevant to your business goals. We want to define these categories so that these particular categories can receive the most precise data treatment. Once you've defined your business goals and assessed probably what categories you want to focus on, we then need to determine our calculation methodologies and gather the data that is needed to calculate your Scope 3 emissions. And finally, once you kind of pass that step, which is a little bit more difficult than I just made it sound, you'll have a preliminary inventory. Once this is then developed, what you want to do is really engage with your value chain in order to determine both supplier or maybe customer-specific emission factors, improve the accuracy of your Scope 3 inventory, and then start to define, say, a decarbonization strategy for your Scope 3 emissions. So I'll get into a little bit more details around kind of calculation methodologies and where do we start. So as I said, that Scope 3 inventory is divided into those 15 distinct reporting categories. And those can be classified as either upstream or downstream sources. Now, the prioritization of each of these categories, like I said, should be defined by your business goals, the size of the emissions, and your ability to really get the data and decarbonize. So generally, all categories which contribute to your Scope 3 emissions should be included in your calculations. However, we really recognize across all carbon accounting that in some instances it might just be impossible really to gather this appropriate data to accurately calculate your Scope 3 emissions for some of your categories. So in the graph on the slide here on the right, you can see that each of the bubbles, and the larger bubble is a higher percent, represents where people are traditionally reporting their Scope 3 emissions. So on the right-hand side is our upstream emissions. Those are in red. And you can see that most companies tend to report upstream emissions just because it's easier to get this data kind of through your procurement records, and you have more of an influence on your upstream suppliers. It tends to get really, really difficult to start reporting things downstream just because as they leave kind of the area in which you control, sometimes you have no idea where maybe your products are going, what they're being used for, or how they're being disposed. So if this issue is kind of relevant to your company and you just have no idea where those emissions from a particular category may be, where they come from, or appropriate emission factors to use, it really is encouraged and acceptable to begin to develop methodologies and procedures to really gather and collect this data and engage with your value chain. And then maybe in your initial iteration of your Scope 3 inventory, you might leave off a couple of categories, really with a plan to add these at a later date. So really, I think the most important point that I'm trying to make here is that when you're developing a Scope 3 inventory, especially for your first time, this is a very, very iterative process. And really, we can always add new categories or change our calculation methodologies as more data becomes available. We'll take to the next slide, Ariel. Thank you. So some questions you might want to ask as you're really trying to define, what categories do I start with? What should be the most important categories are, like I said, what categories are relevant and what categories are material? So some questions that you might want to ask yourself when determining if a category is relevant is, could you influence the emissions from this category in any way, right? So do you pay for that upstream transportation? And maybe you could pay for a supplier that has more low carbon transportation. Are emissions from the source maybe deemed critical by key stakeholders? Is a particular industry in the news recently for having high scope 3 emissions? If they are, you probably want to include it in your scope 3 inventory if, for example, they have anything to do with your value chain. Are emissions from this source maybe outsourced activities that are typically performed in-house by other companies in your sector? So maybe you don't own kind of the processing plants or you use another company to do your manufacturing and you're just responsible for the selling of those goods. Maybe, for example, you then definitely want to include those manufacturing emissions in your inventory. Another question you could ask is, have emissions from this source been identified as significant by your peers or by sector-specific guidance? Or if, maybe we only have financial data, which kind of activities is your company spending a lot of money on? So maybe does this source require a high level of spending within your operations? Now, once we've thought about the relevance, kind of trying to, at a high level, before you dig really deep into the data, you want to determine the materiality. So you want to understand, do the emissions from this category contribute significantly to your total anticipated scope 3 emissions? And really kind of ranking what are the highest scope 3 categories, because we want to spend the most time on these categories in our data collection step. So once we've defined both that relevance and priority of our scope 3 categories, we then need to define the appropriate calculation methodology as well as gather all the data. And I like to say usually kind of these two activities, so gathering the data and determining the calculation methodology, are really done kind of hand in hand. So obviously our calculation methodology will define the data that we need, but sometimes we might not have some of the data, so we'll have to use what's available, and you really use that to determine what calculation methodology we're going to follow, at least right now. So there's many different calculation methodologies for each category. The GHG protocol does a really good example of outlining these kind of in their scope 3 guidance document. There's some really nice decision trees. But generally, our calculation methodologies are either spend-based, average data, or supplier-specific. And then we also have hybrid methodologies in there because a lot of companies sometimes will have a mix, and you can always combine these different methodologies, even within a category. So our spend-based methodologies, basically what they do is they use financial spend data and industry average emission factors, which are per dollar spend, in order to calculate our GHG emissions. This is kind of a really low accuracy method. You can imagine that, due to ever-changing global economics, this calculation methodology, especially with recent, inflations, might not be as accurate as some of our other methodologies. So if we have more data than, say, just financial data, maybe you have consumption data, whether that be, volumetric consumption or unit consumption values, we can use the average data method and industry average emission factors in order to calculate your scope 3 emissions. Now, this type of calculation, it is significantly more accurate than the spend-based methodologies, but we're still going to be using industry average or global average emission factors. So a good example of this is maybe you purchase steel for that electric vehicle that I was talking about. You know the actual tonnage of steel that you're producing to make that car, and we can use a industry average or global average emission factor of steel. That might not be super indicative of, the exact emissions associated with, say, the facility that you purchased the steel from, but it'll probably become pretty close. The third method is really that supplier-specific method. So this is using, your supplier's own scope 1 and scope 2 activity data in order to determine, say, the product carbon intensity or emission factor of your purchased goods and services, or really any upstream or downstream activities. Because you're using actual data from your value chain, we can really be certain in this case that you're getting the most accurate estimate of your Scope 3 emissions. So this really is our highest accuracy methodology. However, you can imagine maybe you're a manufacturing company that has 1,000,000 or 1,000, to be realistic, purchased goods and services. Contacting all those suppliers and say getting all that specific supplier-specific data might just not be possible at this time. So sometimes companies will be able to get some of that. Maybe there's 1 or 2 key suppliers that you're engaged with, and you can use their emission factors. And the rest we might then default to average data methods. So that's why this hybrid methodology exists. Because you're always able to kind of use a combination of these methods, and it is recommended to move towards higher accuracy methods as you start to engage with your value chain more and get the data that is needed for these types of calculations. So that's just a background on really how to calculate Scope 3 emissions, and I'll pass it over to Kaio, who will talk a little bit more about SINAI's approach.
Thanks, Alicia. So for now on, the idea is actually to cover how SINAI approaches to measure and manage the company's Scope 3 emissions. So as our approach, we follow a 6-step approach that it's in line with the GHG protocol recommendations in order to assist our clients in building the easiest, but at the same time, the most accurate Scope 3 inventory. So in the first step, we walk our clients to define their Scope 3 boundaries in order to identify which categories can be applied to their business. And as part of the second step, we identify their business goals, like an SBTi target or any type of target connected to green bonds, sustainability linked bonds, any other stakeholder commitment that could influence the company defining its mitigation option in the future. The reason why identified business goals are important is because we identify relevant Scope 3 activities by performing a materiality and relevant assessment, as Alicia mentioned. This assessment will support us in the step 4 and 5. These 2 steps, they actually are concurrently work with our clients to determine what type of data they have available and to define the best, most accurate methodology that's going to be applied to calculate their emissions. Based on step 2 and 3, we can identify which categories need to be more precisely calculated based on their importance. For example, it's not a good idea to develop rough estimation of emissions for the most relevant Scope 3 category for a company, because this will impact significantly their results. So for example, using the car that Alicia, the use case of car that Alicia mentioned, it's not good to estimate your steel emissions from your purchased goods and services using spend-based data, because probably in the future, it's going to be difficult to define mitigation strategies to that steel. But in the other hand, it might not be interested to put a lot of effort collecting data for a category that will not make a huge contribution to your overall emissions. Mainly, if that category will not be part even of your Scope 3 targets, if your set up targets using SBTi requirements. And it's where we can, at the same time, prioritize, select, and collect data concurrently. We select the calculation methodology. And as Alicia mentioned, we have all methodologies from spend-based to average data method-based methodologies integrated into SINAI system, enable all methodologies to be used. As a final step of these iterations is to make a data quality assessment in order to improve their Scope 3 inventory over time. In this step, we can identify relevant suppliers to improve data collection and get more precise data. For this, SINAI has gone even further and developed a value chain module. What this module does is enable our clients to share their emissions data directly with each other to utilize supplier and customer specific emission factors and improve your understanding of your value chain emissions. So an example of this, we developed a pilot project with several companies from the agri sector to start sharing their emissions across the value chain. So in SINAI, we developed a different approach to calculate product emissions intensity. Instead of calculating emissions in each process and like an LCE approach, at SINAI, we developed a complete scope 1 and 2 inventory, and then we allocate emissions to each product depending on their contribution. The idea is to be able to develop a corporate inventory and allocate appropriately your emissions to your products, avoiding missing any auxiliary emission sources that are not directly connected to the product. After you having your emissions allocated, you can connect with your buyers or your suppliers to share your emissions of a specific product. And at the same time, you can keep your data privacy. Although transparency is very important, like disclosing your scope 3 emissions, keeping data privacy can enable the company share emissions intensity from specific facilities or even from specific products. Another advantage of calculating and share primary data, besides accuracy, is that secondary data is not usually updated frequently. So there are a lot of emissions factors that are actually out today. So at SINAI, product intensity value can be calculated in a yearly basis, so which can also demonstrate commitments from suppliers that are reducing emissions over time. And in the buyer perspective, having this kind of information can support a supplier assessment and a performance tracking of their scope 3 emissions. And based on this pilot project, we have found that secondary data, for example, coming from LCA databases, can be up to 800% higher compared to primary data. And we are releasing our in-depth findings of this pilot project soon, so we'll be sure to share our report with the webinar participants as well. And after you have a complete understanding of your scope 3 emissions, it's time to start defining your mitigation pathways. As it's hard to develop a scope 3 inventory compared, for example, to a scope 1 and 2, defining mitigation strategies can also be difficult depending on your data quality. So regarding challenges and opportunities of mitigate scope 3 emissions, the first challenge, and I think is the highest challenge, is actually to obtain primary data, which can be difficult due to many reasons, right? So suppliers not developing GH inventories or suppliers with multiple products that are not disclosing emissions intensity at the product level, or even using different measurement unit types that cannot be compared to the unit that you were purchasing a specific product. Furthermore, most of the downstream emissions will require a huge effort and influence in the chain. So it's very important to evaluate your capacity to influence your value chain to get emission reductions. Also, depending on where you are on the chain, it's harder to influence your customers than your suppliers to reduce your emissions. However, we've seen a lot of pressures from the society for companies to reduce their carbon footprint, which is changing consumer behavior and can benefit, for example, less carbon intensive products. So as part of the opportunities, model mitigation options will require commitments from different stakeholders, like from suppliers, but also stakeholders as part of your downstream emissions, but also internal departments in the companies, such as product procurement teams, business development, and even product teams. Because mitigation opportunities can be modeled by shifting to less carbon intensive suppliers or low carbon technologies, but a company can also think about changing their business model, applying, for example, circular economy strategies. And as an example of those strategies, model mitigation opportunities for scope 3 can be hard, actually depending on the accuracy of your emissions. So shifting from modal road to rail in order to transport your products, it's an opportunity that could be modeled without necessarily primary data. Even though there are some uncertainty around these calculations, but many categories will not be covered by this situation, for example. These will be applied, for example, for most of the transportation or, for example, business travels as well. On the other hand, if you are in a position of evaluating, for example, ink suppliers, it is not possible to identify emission reduction potential if you will apply the same emission factor for both companies. So in this case, it is required to have a supply-specific data if you want to compare both companies. So if this supplier-specific emissions factor is not possible in this case to evaluate your emission reduction potential, model mitigation opportunities needs to be based on technology shift, for example. So model mitigation opportunities in this case, in the value chain, will depend actually on case to case, but primary data is definitely the best approach in order to define a solid reduction strategy. So I think we are ending our webinar, but as the key findings that we found, so we covered a lot of today. So to reiterate, like some of the key points we covered, Scope 3 has two main groups. We define them like as upstream activities and downstream activities. Share responsibility in the value chain emissions as it gets required from different actors like investors and society, each one being part of the value chain. The Scope 3 can be developed and use a different calculation methodology depending on the data availability, but also your business goals. SINAI approach is to develop your Scope 3 inventories as a 6-step journey, where you can define the boundary of your Scope 3 inventory, identify your business goals, and develop a relevance and materiality assessment in order to build a robust Scope 3. SINAI approach ends in the data quality assessment, where you can define hotspots, where you can either improve your GHG accounting, but also define mitigation strategies. And in order to define mitigation strategies in Scope 3, there are some challenges like obtaining primary data and what is accompanying influence in the value chain to reduce emissions. Defining mitigation strategies for Scope 3 emissions will also require engagement from other departments in the company, like the procurement team. However, there are some good opportunities to reduce emissions in the value chain, even if primary data is essential to model mitigation opportunity for some categories. So even if it is essential or it's the best way to reduce your emissions, there are some potential opportunities even if you don't have primary data, for example, by shifting technologies. So I think we have covered most of the how to measure and manage your Scope 3, and I pass it over to Ariel for the Q&A session.
Thanks so much, Caio and Alicia, for a great presentation on such an interesting topic and very complex. I do not see any questions just yet. Feel free to drop them in the chat or ping us directly if you'd like to ask a question anonymously. So
Ariel,
I will.
There are some questions in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. Would you mind reading them, Alicia?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the questions is, does spend-based factors include all upstream and downstream categories, or just selected categories? Caio, I don't know if you want to take that.
There are some approaches that you can either use upstream and downstream, but depends on the database that you're going to use for spend-based. So for example, US has the extended and input and output, environment extended input and output, where you can find upstream and downstream categories that can be applied emissions factors for some of the categories. I'm not sure if it covers all the categories, but most of them it's covered by this one. And also you can use quantities as a reference from emissions for most of the emission, the Scope 3 categories as well.
Great, thank you. Another question is, there are a number of LCA databases where emission factors can be found. Is there any recommendation for selecting the source of the emission factors? So I can take that, and then Kaio, if you have anything to add, go ahead. I think the first place you want to start is, because there's so many LCA databases, but you don't need to use necessarily an LCA database in your analysis. I think I spoke, about developing the battery electric vehicles. If you wanted to use steel as an example, there would be a number for steel emissions in an LCA database, but maybe you want to use something a little bit more industry specific, because that's probably a little bit more recent and maybe more relevant to your operations. So a number, say, from like the World Steel Association, for example, might be a better option than a generic eco-invent number. That's not to say the numbers in the LCA databases are wrong or a bad place to start, but I think getting as specific as possible to your particular value chain, whether that be by picking emission factors from, say, your exact region where the goods are coming from, or being used, or from your exact industry, is probably the preference if you're still using average data. And then if we, can't find emission factors in that particular range, then we can go to our general LCA databases. EcoInvent, which we do use in SINAI, does have region-specific emission factors. So generally, if clients do know, say, generally where goods are coming from in a particular region, we'll check EcoInvent and try and use the region-specific one if that was available. Kaio, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, just to add to that, like some of these LCA databases, they also have like a documentation where you can find the time scope for that specific emissions factors, so you can compare of using more up-to-date emissions factors for your specific region. For example, if you're comparing two different databases with the same region-specific emissions factors, maybe they have like different time scopes. So maybe you can find this documentation and select the most up-to-date emissions factors to be applied to your business, for example. So, and also the boundaries of each one of the databases can also impact on the emission factors as well. So there are, you can make like a deep quality assessment of to select what methodology you would take. But as Alicia mentioned, it depends on your business and the structure of your inventory as well.
Another question here is, do you at SINAI have any experience completing Scope 3 emission inventories for municipalities or regional governments? If so, what are some of the main challenges you encountered, and how have you overcome them throughout your assessment approach? Kaio, do you have any thoughts? You want to start with that one?
I'm not sure if municipalities and regional governments, they are following the same GHG protocol governance. And as far as I know, they are following very closely the IPCC national greenhouse gas inventories approach. That's my far understanding around this, but I don't have a deep experience on this use case. Alicia, do you want to add something?
No, yeah, I think, like Kaio said, this presentation is really, really focused right now for companies. I think that is our core experience at SINAI. If you were interested in understanding, Scope 3 emissions from municipality or regional governments, like Kaio said, generally that is done through like a whole inventory as per IPCC. But if you guys are interested in contacting us, we're more than welcome to talk to you more about that offline.
Yep.
Okay, one last question is, when do you want to improve accuracy for your data suppliers? And you ask your supplier for their emission factor intensity. When you want to improve your accuracy and you ask your suppliers for their emission factor intensity, should you consider Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of your suppliers? Did you get that, Kaio? Do you want to take it, or do you want me to take it?
You want to take this one? I can.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, so I think it depends whether your supplier is like a tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3. So tier 1 suppliers are the ones that are directly connected to you. So they're the ones that you're actually purchasing or selling your emissions, or purchasing or selling your goods to, let's say, for example. Um, Generally, you're just asking for scope 1 and 2. If you get a supplier's scope 3 as well, then basically you're double counting, for example, your emissions. And if you're also contacting, say, your tier 2 suppliers and they're giving your scope 3, then there's a lot of that double counting between your scope 3 emissions. So generally, if you are reaching out to, say, every single point on the value chain in an ideal world, and we know that's, theoretically probably not going to happen, you would just want to look at the scope 1 and 2 emissions. But maybe if you're just contacting your tier 1 suppliers, so that's kind of the direct sale of materials to you, you would want their scope 1, 2, and say their 3 upstream, because then that would account for everything kind of prior to their emissions. So like it is a quite a complex process. And generally when a lot of suppliers, or when you're asking these questions of your suppliers, trying to get as much data as you can, is what I like to do. So you can ask them for their scope 1, 2, and 3. See if they can give you even scope 3 in terms of like emissions for each of the scope 3 categories. And then depending when you're putting all your information together in your assessment, you can pull the information you need from those requests, to get the most relevant data that you need to calculate your scope 3 emissions. But Kyle, do you have anything else to add?
Nope, I think you covered most of it.
Okay. Okay, there's another one here. So since supplier-specific data method is preferred, how can we ensure the data provided by our suppliers is accurate? Do you want to take that one, Kyle?
Yeah, so first of all, it's important to say that, for example, at SINAI, we try to ensure that the company is developing a complete scope 1 and 2 inventory. So if we are asking for supply specific, probably it's going to be accurate because you're going to develop at least your scope 1 and 2 inventory. So for sometimes you can also ask for if that company has verified their emissions the emissions were verified by a third party. So you can validate that amount of emissions has been verified by a third party, and you ensure that it's accurate, that amount of emissions that it has been shared with you. So this is one of the possibilities to ensure data quality assessment as well.
I see a few more last minute questions coming in. Kai or Alicia, what is your take on auditing scope 3 emissions? Will this ever be possible?
This is a hard one. Yeah, you want to take on this one?
Maybe just as a preface, I think most auditing, I'll say, that's currently done right now isn't actually on the inventory, but a lot of people are auditing their calculation methodologies, or not necessarily auditing, but verifying is the more correct word to use in that context. So you can verify that you're following the right approaches, all the relevant data and material information is included in your scope 3 inventory, and all the goods that would be relevant to your operations or transportation or every other scope 3 activity is included. I think in terms of actually auditing the data, we're going to need a lot more complex data and value chains emissions in order to be able to really audit and trace everything, because you can't prove that those emissions are correct if the data is everywhere, and it's really hard to trace it. So that's my particular take on it. I think getting a verified scope 3 inventory in terms of calculation methodologies is definitely a step in the right direction, because it indicates that you are following the appropriate procedures, and probably your scope 3 inventory is as accurate as possible. But actually auditing the data and the results is a really complex problem.
Yes, and as Alicia mentioned, there is not like when you're verifying your emissions for scope 3, for example, Arabito will not evaluate if your scope 3 emission factors it's right or wrong, or it's inaccurate or accurate. Because if you have like that, like this is the way that you just need to show how it has been collected, but it won't be evaluating if it's inaccurate or if it's right or wrong.
Yeah, great. That's a great question. And in that same vein, we have a question. Since the supplier-specific methodology is preferred, how can we ensure that data provided by our suppliers is accurate? A great question.
Area, I think we did that one, didn't we?
Oh,
yeah.
Apologies.
Yeah.
Another good question. How can you set a target for reduction based on scope 3 because you are not in control of those emissions?
Yeah, the idea of start reducing emissions in your scope 3, it's part of the strategy of a company. So it needs to go of a supplier assessment of changing from supplier to a less carbon intensity supplier, for example, or it can be based also in technology. So you can shift between technologies. So instead of like hiring a transportation that will be using fuel-based fuel, you can shift from a company that it's using electrical vehicles to transport your products. And also you can think about financial emissions, where you can start reduce your emissions to activities that are carbon intensive, for example. So that the way that you can set up a target and reduce your emissions on scope 3 will depend on the influence that you have on your chain. Alicia, you want to add anything?
No, I think that's perfect.
Okay, great. So many great questions from everybody participating. Thank you so much for submitting these. If you have any additional questions, you can either quickly submit them now or you can reach out to us and we're happy to answer your questions very much in depth. Please connect with us on LinkedIn. We're so appreciative that you joined. That we will end the webinar, and until next time, everyone, we'll be sure to send out a recording of the webinar, as I mentioned earlier, and we're looking forward to hosting our next webinar. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.